Hi, it's Tom Collinger and Jonathan Copulsky again in our last segment about the learning from the Technology Fallacy, the book that we've been covering in the last set of interviews. We've talked about the knowing and doing gap. We've talked about the absorptive capacity of companies being able to respond. We've talked about something called affordances. And then finally, last section, we talked about talent, what to do about talent and the importance of becoming a learning machine. So finally, how do you put all of this together? And one of the things that is making both of us smile a little bit is the fact that the two of us come from an age-old direct and database marketing background, which turns out to be the kind of learning that it turns out a lot of the enterprises really need to adopt, yes?
Absolutely. So, Tom, I know you have a long background in direct marketing, both on the agency side and also on the client side. I started my first job out of business school in magazine publishing, and there, a critical part of what we did was A/B testing. The notion that we had a promotion that worked, we'd send out that promotion, we send out a variation, we take a couple of months, we do the analysis and say, aha, this is a better way to promote the magazine. So, early in our collective DNA, we both got this experience of test and learn.
How does that apply? I mean, the language of today is more about fail fast.
Yeah.
Does it apply?
Well, I personally hate that language because most organizations that I've been associated with don't really reward failure. And we've talked about failure, and certainly it's part of the spirit of Silicon Valley, where people talk about this notion of failing forward, failing fast, and so forth. But in fact, I think it's really about how do we get very smart at designing tests? How do we get very smart at executing the test? How do we get very smart at learning from the test? And then when the tests are successful, how do we scale this thing real quickly? And so what we often find is A, organizations don't test, B, they don't really figure out how to harvest the learning, but even then, how do they go from little small experiments to large scale scaling?
So let's talk about that. How does that happen?
Well, one is that we now have technology that allows us to do the test and learn a lot more quickly, right? So whether it's marketing technologies or other types of technologies, machine learning and so forth, so we can get a lot smarter at doing this stuff real quickly. And in a digital environment, what we often see is that the organizations say the difference between the mature and the less mature is that the mature organizations have figured out how to take what they learn and then scale the things up.
So I'm going to do a real distillation. I think you've been talking a lot about a kind of a real corporate evolution, starting with self-awareness.
Yeah.
So the knowing-doing gap really is being aware of where you are and then recognizing your ability to be able to shift and change. Then once recognizing that ability to actually start to put into place some of these things, hopefully in ways that also continue to reward and sustain the value of the talent that's there, right?
Absolutely. And look, recognize that many legacy organizations, the reason why they've been successful is because they've created these processes that allow them to produce standardized products, standardized offerings, and so forth. So we've taken variation out of what we do because that is part of our DNA in these legacy organizations. So now we're saying, let's try something different, let's experiment, and so forth. And we've grown up in organizations that have weeded out experimentation because we want to produce standardized products with very little variation, because every car that comes off that assembly line, we don't want a little experimentation, we want the car that works and is done to plan. So figuring out how to infuse this, it's easy with startup organizations, right, which is prototyping and so forth. It's much more difficult with legacy organizations.
So you've kind of described a shift from the fears associated with, what are we going to do? Here comes this tremendous change in technology. What are we going to do? To actually one of embracing it as the fuel to actually facilitate growth and change.
Yep. So some of the lessons that we've learned from talking to digital leaders, one is that they know how to test small.
Mm-hmm.
So they figure out, you don't take multi-million-dollar things and test, you test small. Number two is that they test enough. So there's a funny quote from Thomas Edison, all of us know, the inventor of the light bulb, among other things, and he says, look, I've not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. Now, we don't need to do 10,000 tests, but we need to test enough to understand what works. And number 3 is that we need to learn fast. And one of the research findings that we had is that digitally mature organizations share results from failed experiments. So they share it within the organizations, and the goal is that they can increase learning because everybody in the organization knows. So once again, this goes back to the conversation that we had of absorptive capacity. How do I take what I learned in one part of the organization and disperse that throughout the entire organization so that the organization learns the lessons that have or haven't worked in other places?
This is great. So this has been a really great set of sessions, Jonathan. Thanks so much. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, so was there any surprise that you found personally from this tremendous background and experience you've had talking with and working with companies over the years?
So the biggest surprise when we did the research really stood out at me is this issue about talent. Right? You know, both you and I work in an educational organization where we're focused on creating the next generation of talent. And this notion that people want to learn, and this notion that they will go to organizations where they can learn, and that seems to imply an imperative, which certainly when I started out in the workplace more than 40 years ago, yeah, I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow and so forth, but it was really about sort of getting ahead in the hierarchy. And now this notion that organizations have a responsibility to create these ongoing learning environments, I think really kind of surprised me at not just that it existed, but it existed to the degree that it did, and it existed across all the age cohorts, and that surprised me.
Well, it's encouraging, I think, not just for enterprises like Northwestern, but really for the future of enterprises who become learning organizations. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for doing it. Thanks so much for writing the Technology Fallacy, and onward.
Thank you very much.